Welcome into Next Level, Inside Carolina's newest YouTube show. I'm your host, Tommy Ashley. That's the other host, Greg Barnes. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Got a special guest today. I'll let Greg get us started.
Well, Tommy, thank you. Yeah, we got a fun guest today to talk a little bit about some Heisman stacking in terms of where Drake Maye resides on that list, along with some other big names around the country, and also about the Carolina weight game. Joe Lisi for GoForThe2.com also does some work for Sports Grid at Sports Grid on Twitter for your betting options and some good picks. And then you also, Joe, do a radio show on SiriusXM. So you have your hands in a lot of different multimedia functions, don't you?
Oh, guys, thanks for having me, Greg and Tommy. Yeah, this is what it's all about, right? The final stretch run of college football. North Carolina playing lights out with Drake Maye. And, right now, right here, week number 11, we still don't know who's the front runner for the Heisman Trophy, even though maybe on paper it's C.J. Stroud, Hendon Hooker right there. They still have a few tough ball games to play out in the month of November, and there can be a dark horse such as potentially maybe Bo Nix or another hot quarterback, and maybe Jaden Daniels that could steal the show.
When you look at that list, C.J. Stroud obviously plays for a team that's expected to play in the college football playoff. Hendon Hooker, as of last week, was playing for the number one team in the country before they go and lose at Georgia. How important in the Heisman race is it for guys in contention to be in that CFP conversation as compared to a Drake Maye, who's, while North Carolina's has the potential to make the CFP, they're still sitting at number 15 in the rankings and have a long way to go to get up to that same level.
Yeah, great point. I think it really matters whether the team is in terms of in contention of the college football playoff. We've seen Heisman Trophy winners such as Joe Burrow, such as Devontae Smith, and you can go back to the days of Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield. They were all in contention. The last quarterback that wasn't in contention was Lamar Jackson, right? In terms of that 8-5 overall record, but all he did was dominate each and every week. And in terms of the highlight reels, every week on SportsCenter, you saw Lamar Jackson breaking a dynamic run or doing things that we just never saw before out of the quarterback position. We've evolved now. There's a lot of quarterbacks putting up numbers across the Pac-12 and across the East Coast as well. I mean, just that's the problem when we talk about quarterbacks as a whole, right? Michael Penix, Bo Nix putting up numbers, Caleb Williams, DTR, they're all comparable per se, but where are they in relation to top 25 opponents? Where are they in relation to maybe those top 10 games? And that's where you're seeing right now, unfortunately, C.J. Stroud and Hendon Hooker sort of separate themselves from the rest of the crowd.
Joe, let me ask you a question about that, and that's an aspect that's certainly bannered around on our message boards a lot at Inside Carolina is Stroud did not look good last week. Obviously, Ohio State's going to be in the conversation at the end. How does game-by-game basis for those guys on those teams, Ohio State, Bo Nix, Auburn, Oregon's gotten back into it, but that game against Georgia, how does a single game affect those guys as compared to maybe a single game might affect a guy like Drake Maye?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, Tommy. I think it does matter, and when does it matter, right? So if we're taking the example of, let's say, Bo Nix, the week one performance was absolutely atrocious against Georgia, but he sort of rectified that, and that's a foregone conclusion in terms of where he's playing right here, right now. Now, he's going to have a stiff test, right? He plays Washington, one of the most underrated rivalries in terms of all of college football. He's going up against not just a solid defense, but potentially an elite quarterback in Michael Penix Jr. on the other side, right? So that matchup will matter. Can he outduel Michael Penix? He has to follow that up with another blue-collar team in terms of Utah. That's a very physical defensive front. Let's just say they dominate that ball game. He then maybe has a rematch against either, let's say, UCLA and Dorian Thompson-Robinson or Caleb Williams. So the potential to go up against those top 25 teams with those notable quarterbacks will really benefit a player like Bo Nix. On the flip side, for C.J. Stroud, I agree with you. It hasn't looked good at times. Week 1 against Notre Dame, it was the game plan of Marcus Freeman to slow down the tempo, keep that offense on the sidelines and run the football. And Penn State had that sort of game plan as well and had the fourth quarter lead heading into the about 8 minutes left. But it wasn't Stroud that really took over. It was the defense. So I think it does matter. But if Stroud goes out and, let's say, lights up Michigan for 6 or 7 touchdowns, then all of a sudden everybody remembers the last performance, and that's why he'll get the edge. And not only that, Tommy, but the body of work from where he was last year to this year, I think that factors into the Heisman voters. Not just me. I mean, I don't buy into it. I think it's just this year. But the Heisman voters look at the body of work as compared to where a player is maybe right here, right now in terms of this year's performance.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And these guys that get a lot of the hype and a lot of the press and all that all during the season, especially for the higher ranked teams. Let me sort of swerve off the road a little bit and ask you this question. How much does how much of a school is it their job to sort of push their player? You know, we've seen Heisman campaigns. I remember Oregon, what's his name on the mural in New York City?
Joey Harrington.
Joey Harrington, yeah, and all that. So, I mean, how much does that come into it, do you think, for Heisman voters and paying attention?
I think it's important. I mean, I'm part of the FWAA. I still get notepads from Iowa and Spencer Petras, right, in terms of the Heisman, which is absolutely ridiculous, by the way. But they still do their part in terms of, there it is, right? They pump up their players each and every year, and they should do that, right? You know, and if we're talking Drake Maye, I know we haven't broke it down, but he's an under-the-radar player, right? We know about Sam Howell. I think it's unfortunate if we're talking just Drake Maye right here, right now. He has comparable numbers, Tom, to where Hendon Hooker was a year ago. 31 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 71% completion percentage, 6 games over 300, right? But what stands out in terms of the Drake Maye resume? The 1 loss to Notre Dame in terms of a ranked opponent. That's the one thing I think that'll maybe be a detriment for Drake Maye. But if we're looking big picture, he's definitely on the radar in terms of the elite performers in terms of college football. It's unfortunate how perception really garners this award because there's some great quarterbacks out there. And I think we need another metric to really break it down in terms of how elite a quarterback is playing against a particular team or defense for that matter.
I think you're dead on about that. In terms of kind of how you see things stacking up right now in the Heisman race, I know you mentioned CJ and Hendon kind of being at the top. I think most everybody would agree with you on that. Where does Drake Maye fit in that? And, you know, top 5, top 10?
I think he's definitely, I want to say top 7. I mean, here's the thing. Like, if Drake Maye runs the table, they go out and they beat Wake Forest and Winston-Salem, and they, let's just say, assuming Clemson is undefeated in the conference, and they square off against the Clemson Tigers, and he puts up a 400-yard performance, and they win the ACC Championship. I mean, that goes a long way. That goes a long way into the type of player that he is. The problem is, I think, is that it's Mac Brown. Everybody was hoping for this type of performance out of North Carolina last year with Sam Howell. That was on the radar, right? He was the guy. If we would have looked at the NFL draft, Greg, a couple of years ago, right? Sam Howell was potentially a number 1 draft pick. How he fell last year because of the team's slip off and how they performed from a defensive perspective sort of hurt them. Drake Maye is building it back up. It's just a little bit too late, I think, right? So I still think from a performance level, watching Drake Maye play, pocket presence, unbelievable, confident quarterback. He just looks poised. He knows where he wants to go with the football. I mean, has a great touch on his throws. I mean, he is going to be, in my opinion, a great performer. And not only that, he's leading the team in terms of rushing yards, right? I mean, you talk about mobility, you talk about the ability of the RPO game. He has it all. So, you know, it's unfortunate. He can only play the teams that are on his schedule. Who thought Virginia Tech would tail off with a first-year head coach in the body of work? It's unfortunate. But again, there's still a lot of football to be played. Maybe he can inch into the top 5. If he does, in fact, throw maybe close to 50 touchdowns. And, you know, with 3 games left, you can never say never, especially if they're in the championship game.
Right. So that was my next question. In terms of the stats, if he continues at this trajectory and ends up breaking Kenny Pickett's ACC touchdown record and passing yards per game, which he's on track to do, is that enough if North Carolina stumbles, maybe against Wake, maybe against NC State, or even against Clemson in the ACC Championship game, and say Carolina ends up being 20th in the final poll before the Heisman vote? Can he offset that perception of the team with his individual play?
Offset it to where
and get maybe to New York, not necessarily win it, but become a final.
Yeah, well, I think in that scenario it would be difficult. And I always bring this up. If he slips up, does he throw for 450 yards against Wake or NC State or even Clemson and they lose by 1? He could afford that type of slip up, I believe, right? Because he's compiled a great resume. If he puts up 400 yards and the team loses by, unfortunately, let's just say 14 to 17 points, I don't think so in that type of situation. The pressure is on for that performance to close the gap, because the way the market is right now, you have Blake Corum there from Michigan. What happens with that situation? There's a lot of players in front of him, along with the West Coast appeal, that right now I think that would be very difficult to overcome.
Joe, let me ask you a question. We're talking to Joe Lisi. You mentioned Sam Howell last year and how the table was kind of set, the hype was there. Drake's, we'll talk about how great Drake's been for North Carolina for a long time this year. But as far as paying it forward to next year, if he continues this trajectory, say Carolina goes 10-2, 11-2, whatever, it's safe to say, right? He's a main part of the conversation next year, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, you would have to make the argument, not only best quarterback in the conference, but I mean, we're talking top 5 without a doubt. I mean, to be back from where Mac Brown had them when they played Texas A&M a couple of years ago in terms of that bowl game, and then last year, and now to get it back and to go to potentially the ACC Championship, potentially win the ACC Championship, and to put up let's say 40+ touchdowns and maybe have 7, well, he's got 6 now, so let's give him 8 or 9 potential 300 or 400-yard games, right? I mean, that is an unbelievable heading into next year. So yes, without a doubt, he would be one of the front runners to potentially hoist the hardware, assuming he went on that trajectory, without a doubt.
So from a North Carolina team perspective, what do they have to do closing out this season to ensure Maye's going to do what he's going to do? We'll agree he's going to have those numbers. What from a team perspective does Carolina need to do the rest of this season?
The road games and the games on the neutral field, and I'm talking about the ACC Championship, you can't play down, right? Because we've seen them struggle on the road this year. Last week against Virginia, 3-point game, even though they turned it on in the second half. Game was maybe never in doubt, still a 3-point game. App State, they struggled. Miami was a 1-score game with 2 minutes left. You want to see them take care of business in a dominating way on the road. They have an opportunity as a 3.5-point underdog this week in Winston-Salem. It's going to be a very difficult ball game, in my opinion, but assuming they do that and then they challenge Clemson, I think that's what you want to see. You want to see them be able to close ball games out on the road and not play down to the level of competition such as the Virginias and the Miamis, for that matter.
Joe, let's switch it over to this ball game this weekend.
Sure.
Wake has struggled the last 2 weeks. They played really good defenses. That's not what North Carolina is known for this year.
Right.
And Wake's been pretty good at home. So how do you see this game shaping up?
Yeah, I think Hartman's going to look for this game, because this was the game where Ty Chandler and, as you know, North Carolina really knocked them out last year. It was a back and forth affair before they broke it open with about 3 minutes left with the touchdown run, and they never looked back. So I think that's a concern. When I look at the betting market, unfortunately, I am leaning in terms of Wake Forest for that bounce back spot. The fact that they have lost 2 straight, you could say they're playing down, but I think they get up for this ball game. I like the running game of Wake Forest, and I think if we're talking defenses, I like Wake's defense playing at home a little bit better in run support than I like North Carolina on the road, right? We've seen them give up a ton of yards to Notre Dame and App State, 200 yards plus. That is the cause of concern. If they can keep Wake Forest to say $140, $130, they're going to win this ball game in terms of the running game. If they can't, and they give up their season average, or they give up close to 220 yards in this matchup, I think Wake Forest wins and covers this ball game anywhere from 7 to 10 points. I think it looks eerily similar to what we saw last year. It goes back and forth, and then in the end, maybe Wake catches a late touchdown and they wind up covering. But that's why they play the games. I know I'm on a Carolina message board and publication, so, hey, I'm not afraid. If I'm wrong, I'll be the first one to admit it.
Looking at the matchup, and you threw me off there admitting if you were wrong. Yeah, I've been wrong. I've been wrong a lot, so I'm with you there. Looking at the matchup, obviously Wake jumped out to big leads prior. Carolina was able to come back. I agree with you. It's going to be a similar type ball game. When you start looking at the over, and last time I saw it, it was 78.5.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I think that's kind of low, though, right?
It seems low. Now, I can tell you this. I don't know. You obviously know. 2 years ago, during the COVID year, that was an off-the-rails game, right, in terms of that matchup. I was covering that game. The in-game total, guys, got up, I believe, until like 116, 120. And I was like, there's no way this – like, when does it stop, right? Infinity? Like, you can never see that. But then we see the game last week with SMU. They're still scoring, right? I mean, you can never say never. The problem is, I believe, in terms of this matchup, if you're Wake Forest, you haven't played well, right, in a couple of weeks. So what do you want to do in terms of playing at home? You want to establish the run. You want to sort of keep Drake Maye on the sidelines. And even though both offenses are explosive, you want to establish the ground game. That could tend to lead to an under, right? We're not talking about a 50-point total, Tommy. We're talking almost 80 points here. So if we're talking 80 points and you have one, let's say, or two drives that stall and 7 minutes or 8 minutes go off the clock, then you're looking at an under. That's the one, I would say, detriment to backing this total Saturday, where I feel more strong about Wake Forest than I do the total, because it wouldn't shock me if it gets to the 100. It wouldn't shock me if they play this game in the 50s.
Let me and appreciate you joining us. I know we're short on time. Let me ask you about that SMU game. I mean, as a betting guy and a guy that sets these and deals with it, have you seen anything like that before? I mean, college football, you said off the rails 2 years ago, Carolina. That was off the rails.
Right. Yeah, there's no defense. I mean, I've equated the sports gambling, and I've been following college football for a very long time. I mean, covering it well over 20 years, right? The difference is that when you look at college football now compared to where we were in the mid-2000s, it is almost eerily similar to college basketball. They don't play defense. The team that weathers the 20-0 run is typically the team that wins the ball games. You're going to have these, teams that jump out 3 scores. Can you make adjustments, and can you weather the storm emotionally? If you could do that, you'll win these matchups. But again, certain teams just match up against each other, and they just don't have answers from a defensive perspective. That could be maybe the case in terms of this ball game Saturday night in Winston-Salem. I am curious to see how it plays out.
Joe, before we let you go, I've got one more, and I did not give you a heads up on this, so I'm not going to put you on the spot. Carolina has not yet clinched the Coastal. I think ESPN has them as like a 98.6% likelihood of winning the Coastal. It's probably going to happen. When you look ahead to what Clemson's done, and granted they didn't look good the other night, but Clemson, North Carolina, ACC Championship game, do you think Carolina has much of a chance in that ball game from what we know about these two teams right now?
Yeah, I think they do. Here's the situation. Clemson, right here, if they played right now, we know what Clemson wants to do. They want to pound the rock with Will Shipley. They want to establish the line of scrimmage, and we want to see if Carolina could shut down the run, right? It's almost like a triple option attack. That is their best weapon right now, is the running game. When they run the football effectively, they win ball games. They did put up 293 against Syracuse. They didn't run it effectively against Notre Dame because Notre Dame jumped up and took the run game out. Once they fall behind, that is the cause of concern. So if you're Drake Maye and you're Carolina, I'm looking at this ball game to jump up just the way Wake Forest did, Greg, against Army last year. Let's get them out of the running game and then put the ball game onto DJU or Klubnik, and now it's game on. We have the better quarterback in this matchup. So I think they have a very good shot to face Clemson. We've seen Clemson secondary give up a ton of yards in terms of the back end. Sam Hartman abused them, and even Syracuse in terms of some plays. So at the end of the day, if they play 4 weeks down the road, Drake Maye playing lights out, yeah, why not?
Elite quarterbacks give everybody a puncher's chance.
Yeah.
And if it comes to pass, it would
right.
be a miracle if it doesn't. But if it comes to pass, I like Carolina's chances as well. That's Joe Lisi at Go for the Two, number 2, on Twitter. Joe, we appreciate you taking time to join us here at Next Level.
Anytime, guys. Love the show. Have a great weekend.
All right, thanks, Joe.
Greg Barnes, it's an interesting take there with the odds and all that. But let's talk Drake Maye Heisman. I think that's the relevant discussion here. He made a lot of relevant points from a national perspective about why Drake's opportunity here is not maybe as big as we think it is on Inside Carolina.
Yeah, he's exactly correct about perception. And that's something that will help Drake next year because he's really laying the groundwork and people are starting to notice. And you're seeing random national media guys after each game saying, wait a minute, did you see what Drake did? They're finally catching on, but it's already November. So I think Carolina has to win. And look, it's not just Drake. There's a lot of quarterbacks that have had great years, a lot of great players over the years that have not really crept in. I mean, if you look at last year, Kenny Pickett, Pitt had a great year. They won the ACC. What did they go? 11-2, whatever it may have been. And he finished a distant third. But if we look at kind of some of the numbers to give people an idea of what Drake Maye is up against, when you look at the last 21 Heisman Trophy winners, 17 of those 21 played for teams that finished in the top 5 of the final AP rankings.
Wow.
And 15 played for conference champions. So that's pretty significant. 7 of those guys played for the number 1 team in the country. And just for reference, Carolina has finished in the AP top 5 once in school history, way back in 1948. So people say, well, what about the other 4? You said 17 out of 21. That's where you kind of get to where Joe was talking about Lamar Jackson. And this makes it a unique case for Drake because when we talked about it last preseason with Sam Howell, granted, Sam ran more last year, but his first 2 years, he was much more of a pocket quarterback. Yes, he could scramble, but that was his thing. What really makes those other 4 guys stand out is their dual threat ability. And so it's Lamar Jackson, it's Eric Crouch from Nebraska, who was more of a runner than he was a passer. Tim Tebow, everybody remembers him. And then, of course, Robert Griffith, who could do a little bit of everything. Those were very explosive, dynamic players who played on teams that weren't the elite of the elite the years that they won the trophy, but they were still pretty good. And so I think Carolina is probably going to have a better record than a lot of those teams. I mean, Eric Crouch, granted, Nebraska went 11-2. Baylor was 10-3 for Robert Griffith. Lamar played for a 9-4 Louisville team. Mm-hmm. And then Florida was 9-4 when Tebow won it. So maybe Carolina gets to that Nebraska record of 11-2. And with Drake's ability to run, maybe that puts him more in the equation. I just really think at this point in time, if he can get an invite to New York, that's going to be kind of the high point of what he can do. Fair or not, that's just the way it is. I think it's going to be a very difficult situation, Tommy. And it really makes me think that this is a kid who could win the Maxwell Award. He could win the Davey O'Brien. He could win the Manning Award, and deservedly so. But even if he wins those awards as the best quarterback, I still think he's not going to be at the top of the Heisman hierarchy this year. But, man, you get to New York as a redshirt freshman, spotlights are going to be on you for the next season.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be anything that we've seen covering North Carolina or North Carolina themselves have seen. Everybody talks about Choo Choo. Well, that was a long time ago.
73 years ago, yeah.
It was a little bit before all of this stuff. You mentioned those other guys. I mean, Lamar Jackson had signature moments all through that season that people talked about. RG3 at Baylor, signature moments, signature wins on the biggest stage. Eric Crouch, that Nebraska team was different. He had been good. Tebow, Tim Tebow, like him or hate him or whatever, he was a fantastic player down there and won a ton. He had a career achievement award too a little bit there. So I think Maye's got an opportunity, and that's why I asked the question to him, and you just talked about it, is to build it this year, and it relies on the team as well. If Carolina was 6-6 and Maye had these numbers, nobody'd be talking about him at all. So I think, and I think you agree here that if Carolina can, whether or not they handle business Saturday or not, but if Maye continues the play and putting up the numbers, and Carolina can get to 10-2 and push Clemson or beat Clemson, and then do something in a bowl, not flame out in a bowl game like they did against Baylor, in 15. I think building that case for next season is where it's at. One thing I've seen, Greg, and you can comment and tell me if I'm wrong here, Heisman voters like the shiny nickels, not necessarily the shiny new nickels. And they will – C.J. Stroud plays for one of the best teams, if not the best team at Ohio State. He has not been good at all. Drake Maye has a game like Stroud had, and they won't talk about Drake Maye again, right? So that is the pressure on Maye to perform. And do I think he cares about these awards? No, not at all. But the pressure to perform is not just on him. It's on the team. It's on the defense. It's on Mac. It's on the coaches and all. It is a group effort. And like I asked, and you held up the notepad from Iowa. That's hilarious. It's on the school. It's on North Carolina.
Every year we get stuff from Iowa. Every year.
And Iowa hadn't scored a touchdown yet this season. If there's anybody, there's our Hawkeyes out here, I apologize. I'm joking, maybe. But yeah, your thoughts on how it falls on North Carolina, the university, to hype this kid, to hype this program, to hype this guy, to get a chance there, because I think that matters a lot.
Yeah, and we've actually had those conversations with UNC over the years, with Mac now and prior to Mac. And the conversation last year before Sam Howell's junior season was you don't want to add pressure to a situation. What you want to do is you want to make sure you illuminate and push out content that says, hey, this is what he's doing. This is how good he's been. So it really is kind of a balancing act. And I think when you're talking about a redshirt freshman, you do have to be careful. I think Drake has done a fantastic job. Obviously, he has the pedigree to be able to handle a lot of that pressure. But he still only played 9 games as a starter. And so you do have to be careful, because if you go out there tomorrow and say, hey, this kid, we think he's going to be the next Heisman Trophy candidate, or he should at least be in New York. If the school is saying that, then does that affect him at all? And if it does whatsoever, then maybe you're setting yourself up. So it really is a balancing act. But North Carolina, they're well aware of it. They understand that they want to make sure they get out as much as they can. They don't have a billboard up in New York Times Square like Joey Harrington, which was phenomenal. And I don't think he had a very good year that year anyway. But that'll be the conversation this offseason for sure is, all right, look, everybody's pointed to 2023 as being the year for the program anyway, especially with Drake Maye coming back, and whether or not it's his final year or not, it's a year where he can go pro and he'll be talked about as a potential #1 draft pick. That's a lot of hype too. So if he's already got the hype, why not go ahead and add some to it? And really, I mean, look, we know what Mac Brown does. He is as good as they come in terms of promoting his program and those types of things. Get him on some of these shows, national shows in the offseason, to really push, hey, have you seen my quarterback? He's pretty good. He's probably the best quarterback in the country. That's not being over the top with it. That's just making sure that people hear Drake Maye's name time and time again. So how they decide to handle that, I think, will be interesting to watch, because there's a couple different ways you can go. But regardless, he's going to get a lot of attention for a lot of these trophies and awards leading into next year. And just like we saw with Sam Howell, they've got to be able to deliver on the field, because if you go and you lose at Blacksburg like Sam did on day one, you're out of the conversation very quickly.
I agree. It is a group effort across the board, from the players, the coaches, the school. And I can say with certainty that sports writers like free stuff. So send out the Drake May coffee mugs and the things like that. Whatever the school needs to do to get as much hype as possible. Because like you said, the hype around the NFL draft's already going to be there. That's not an award. That's a lifetime to go to the NFL and all that stuff. It'll be fun to watch. It'll be interesting to watch the rest of the Inside Carolina podcast schedule this week. We've got the game plan tomorrow night, Thursday. Whenever you're watching this, if it's Thursday, tune in at 9 o'clock on the Inside Carolina YouTube channel. That's Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. This is Next Level, sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, johnnytshirt.com at Inside Carolina. We'll catch you next week. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Tommy.